After spending an exorbitantly long time pursuing the path of the longest journey, one which meandered its way in and out of my life over 2 continents and 3 places of residence, I was determined to not have history repeat itself when it came to the sequel. Whilst I had originally played Dreamfall The Longest Journey way back in the day, when I was still a lowly bank associate on sick leave looking for something to play on my Xbox 360 whilst I had the flu, I had not experienced the original title, so many of the references were lost on me. Cue a couple of years later, maybe 20, and I find myself returning, surprisingly, to the same Xbox 360 hard drive that I had originally downloaded the game to. Whilst the Xbox 360 Live Arcade is now permanently closed to new purchases, you can restore old ones, and you better bet that it's what I did. The story of how my original Xbox 360 came to be in my hands again after I'd left it behind when I moved to Japan is another story, perhaps for another time. For now, let's visit the Dreaming where 2 familiar worlds collide yet again, and a mysterious force threatens to unravel it all. Dreamfall, The Longest Journey, is the sequel follow-up to The Longest Journey, produced by Funcom and published by a variety of studios depending on which territory you resided in. From the imagination of Ragnar Tornquist, we are yet again returned to the worlds of Stark and Arcadia, this time in full 3D. Released in 2006 for Microsoft Windows and the original Xbox, I picked up a version from the Xbox Live Arcade, and as this is a backward compatible title, it means that it is one of the rare games on the Xbox 360 that does not have achievements. What a bummer. Depending on where you reside, it was around 7 years initially between the 2 titles, which is a lot of time for a series that sits in and straddles the point-and-click adventure genre. Dreamfall does away with most of what endeared players to the original title, so may have been a hard pill to swallow at the time. In any case, let's dive in and check out what happened to our beloved, scrappy protagonist April Ryan, and meet some others along the way. Whilst there is a prologue that introduces someone you may be very familiar with from the first game, the main action takes place once the game really begins when we are introduced to Zoë Castillo. I'm going to go out and say it right off the bat. Zoe is no April. From the moment we meet her, we see that she is a despondent woman who has everything, but believes she has nothing, having lost her focus and purpose. She lives in Casablanca with her father, in a rather affluent area where she doesn't need to worry about where she's going to find the money to buy a new dress, let alone a meal, and she definitely doesn't have to fish someone else's pizza out of a trash compactor, though she isn't adverse to digging through garbage. We are introduced to her as she's watching the news, morosely sitting in bed and wasting the morning away with no passion for life. It's a little disheartening to see and compare to April, who had purpose in her drive to make a living out of a career in art. Zoe doesn't seem to really have anything moving her forward other than her on and off again boyfriend Reza, who becomes a catalyst for her to be involved in the narrative. I know it sounds like I am dumping on her, but she really does need some smelling salts to realise that she has a good life, compared to what we have seen of people in Newport. And yes, whilst the picture I am painting may claim that I didn't enjoy her as a character, she did grow on me as we journeyed together, although some of the choices that she made I was still a little unsure of, and she often ended up in dangerous situations that she should not have put herself into, very akin to April. Sometimes I wish she'd have used a little more common sense, and maybe kept up with the gym schedule so she'd be in top form to evade a pursuer, rather than being whacked in the back of the head as soon as she got to the exit. Anyway, let's look at the world she'll be travelling through. Dreamfall places us into unfamiliar settings whilst also not permitting us to forget some areas of the past, which are now realised in a fully interactable 3D environment. Marcuria is faithfully recreated with its stone streets and high alabaster walls, sleeted in snow after it has become besieged by a race that had assisted to drive out the Tyrant, and then never left. The Azadi are a race of human-like people that believe in the tenets of the true goddess, and that magic is not something to be revered, but rather deposed. So lock up magical beings and subjugate them all while spreading the advent of a steam-based technology to the masses. You'll also get to return to Newport, and April's original room in the border house, though nothing is as we remember it, being that it is now 10 years on from the events of the first game, and an event known as the Collapse has caused a great deal of decline in some of the denser metropolitan areas, some of which never recovered. It's not delved into too deeply, but heavily implied that the collapse was an event caused by the stabilization of the balance when April fully restored it by finding the true Guardian in the original game. This event is said to have caused mass static events across Stark that decimated long-distance electronic communication, as well as grounded flights. It was basically Y2K if legacy coding hadn't been remediated before the year 2000. I bring up the collapse as it's important to the events of Dreamfall, with the advent of static which has been affecting the global network called Wire. Wire is basically our internet, and without it, another collapse could be imminent. The static starts occurring around the time Zoe begins seeing images of a young girl in a bleak landscape calling out to her, her long dark hair framing a pale face. And no, it's not Sadako, though with the way Zoe carries on sometimes, maybe she'd have wished that she had found the tape so she could just disappear. The strange girl, on various occasions, reaches out to Zoe directly, asking her to save the cheerleader, save the world. Save April Ryan. And while Zoe doesn't understand what this means at first, through her pursuit of Reza who has disappeared, she eventually comes face to face with the reality of another world, much like April did before her, though she is no shifter. Though for most of the game we play as Zoe, we are also placed into the shoes of two other characters and will be forced to play from their perspectives. The first being April Ryan, the other being Kian Alvani, who is an apostle of the Azadi sent to assassinate April, though he doesn't know that she is his target. I thought the variety of characters and how they each perceived the environment enriched the narrative storytelling and reflected the sensibilities of the cultures that they belong to. For example, in Arcadia, Zoe presents as confused and lost, whereas April makes commentary on how machinery has begun to spring up in place of magic, and Kian comments on how magical beings are almost like a stain and looks down upon them, which is driven by the narrative of the religion he subscribes to. Seeing the different perspectives allowed a greater understanding of the world's political landscape, and especially for Kian, gave a little insight into the Azadi and their ways. Exploring the worlds of Stark and Arcadia, you will encounter some item-based puzzles. Thankfully, there is no moon logic involved, and most of these are straightforward, requiring you to collect, combine, or use items directly with the environment. If I'm being honest, the game was probably a little too easy in this regard. I didn't have to look up the solution to any of the puzzles, as most of them were intuitive. Or maybe I've just done too many escape rooms. Pressing up on the D-pad unsheaths your inventory, and pressing up again on an item allows you to examine or combine it, or use the item with the environment based on proximity and context. To view the world around you, you can use commands that appear when you are near a person or interactable object to converse, examine, or use, though sometimes there are objects that are a little too difficult for our heroes to reach. In these instances, you can use Focus Field by pressing down the left analog stick, locking the character into place and allowing you to rotate a blue field that highlights any points of interest that are within the character's line of sight. I found that in some instances, examining things from a distance, there is harmony. But seriously, the commentary your characters make can differ depending on whether they are observing from afar or up close, which made the world building and character building even stronger. Many of the characteristics of a point-and-click adventure made it across into this 3D environment, and I thought that was enough. But for some reason, someone at Funcom thought it may be fun to include combat into parts of the story, which are an instant game over if you fail. I don't mind combat as an experience. I do play games that predominantly are driven by their battle systems and how you overcome them. However, I don't see how blindly flailing against dodgy hitboxes and lethargic combatants is supposed to be enjoyable. Anytime I was thrown into a hand-to-hand combat situation, I groaned because I knew that I would either die or would somehow win by spamming heavy attack, hoping that there was no gap for the opponent to retaliate. It just wasn't fun, and I don't believe it was a good addition to the game. Just because you can add something doesn't mean that you should. I'd have preferred that dialogue-based choices were the bread and butter of progression, alongside the puzzles and exploration. Speaking of, there are some dialogue choices where you can choose the tone of how your character responds to a situation or question, but it does not really influence the story, only changes its flavour slightly. If that's your thing, you may enjoy it, but I felt that it was also a little weakly implemented and undercooked. I wonder if some of the design choices were driven by corporate upper management, who only care about profits rather than the enjoyment of the players? Am I onto something here? The final gameplay mechanic that I'd like to highlight is hacking, courtesy of software that Zoe's friend Olivia provides to her to allow her to access places that she technically shouldn't be. There are 2 hacking games that you will need to play, the first being a pictograph matching game, where you need to choose the exact same picture from a screen full of changing ones, as a timer counts down to progress. The other being a spinning puzzle where you need to align symbols across 3 spheres, but each sphere can only be rotated independent of each other, and will carry the symbol that is attached to the next one in its next rotation. Yes, that was probably a really shit way to describe both of those, but you get the idea. Neither of them were too difficult, and particularly in the case of the pictograph one, caused frustration more than it did satisfaction, because you'd finally find the pictograph that you were looking for, and then realise you'd taken too much time and it had changed, or you had to start the whole game over again. Now, I did briefly want to talk about the plot and some of its holes, so to do so I will need to highlight some spoilers. I will place a warning here in case you want to play the game yourself. If you don't want to be spoiled, skip to the timestamp listed here. Okay, 3, 2, 1. Overall, I did enjoy the game, but there were some plot points that were left unattended, which was a little disappointing. For starters, at one point you are April, tasked with following a robed man who the innkeeper claims to have not seen. You do manage to catch up to him by going through the underground area that Zoe first found herself in when she arrived in Arcadia, but the prophet and their identity is never mentioned again. I am not sure what the point was at all. And that eddy of energy which sat directly underneath Mercuria, it was never explained really what that was either, or why it was so important other than something about dreams. And I mean, the game is called Dreamfall, but that's really not enough of a thread for me. The story just immediately returned to the search for Reza, and then April leaving Mercuria with the rebels, that it felt like that thread was a little half-baked. I never really understood what that large brain-like thing in the tank at Wadikor was either. If I hadn't have played the first game, I'd have assumed that like how Faith dream in Final Fantasy X, the world of Arcadia is dreamt by the brain and is its creation, but we know that that's not the case if we've played the first game. I also wasn't sure why Zoe was asked to save April Ryan in the first place. I mean, she clearly didn't, and this was also never elaborated on. She was just told that she did. Like, what? Didn't we see her get stabbed and fall into the lake, or the swamp, or whatever it was? And the final egregious thing for me was how quickly Zoe apparently fell for Damien after seemingly only just meeting him and being told that Reza was dead. I know grief can do funny things, but throw you into the arms of someone you barely know in a foreign land? I don't know, it just didn't sit well with me and is definitely not something that I would have done. It was like the writers were like, we need some romance, and added that in, like a half-baked potato, to satisfy a random writing prompt. Graphically, Dreamfall represents a significant shift from the original title by moving into a 3D space. Where The Longest Journey relied on beautiful pre-rendered backgrounds, my jam, Dreamfall places you directly into these environments and permits you to explore them from different angles. At the time, it did seem like the natural evolution, but it does come with some drawbacks. Some of the character models don't look as good as the others. For example, Zoe herself is rendered nicely, but some of the other characters seem to have been pounded with a mallet, blurring and muddying their textures. Facial animations can look a bit wooden as well, which is unfortunate for a game so heavily driven by dialogue. Where the game really shines though, is in its environments. Most of the locations are beautiful, and manage to capture the same sense of wonder that the original game delivered. One area that particularly stood out to me was the wooded region where the Dark People reside amongst the hidden library. There is a quiet serenity to the space. Mercuria is also impressive in its jump to full 3D, adding a sense of continuity between the two titles. Another small but appreciated detail was how the game's interface changes depending upon whether you're in Stark or Arcadia. Stark takes on a more modern, technological appearance that reflects the sleek and corporate nature of that world. In contrast, Arcadia shifts to something more ornate and fantasy-inspired. It's a subtle touch, but one that reinforces the contrast between the worlds in a way that feels very intentional. When it comes to the soundtrack, this is unfortunately one of the areas where Dreamfall did not leave a strong impression on me. It doesn't mean that the music is bad per se, but it largely fades into the background of the experience rather than standing out as something memorable. There were no real tracks that stuck with me throughout or after finishing the game, and if you point blank asked me to hum a melody from it, I'd probably struggle. What does stand out, however, is the voice acting. Across the board, it is generally excellent, and carries a huge portion of the emotional weight of the narrative. Ellie Conrad Lee as Zoë Castillo does an excellent job of portraying a girl who stumbles into something bigger than herself, constantly questioning her own resolve, but sucking it up and continuing anyway. And of course, I cannot not mention Crow, played by Roger Rains, who peppers cynicism with a sprinkle of unabashed optimism, accurately depicting the frenetic nature of a carrion avian. It's a shame that we didn't get to see more of him, and my genuine excitement at seeing him should be captured in a bottle and sold as a pick-me-up. Despite some of the criticisms I have raised throughout this review, I did ultimately enjoy my time with Dreamfall: The Longest Journey. The worlds of Stark and Arcadia are still fascinating, and the narrative ambition on display here is something that few games were attempting at the time. Even with the unresolved plot threads and the occasional questionable design choices, there is a sincerity to the storytelling that kept me invested all the way through. The shift away from traditional point-and-click mechanics may have been jarring, the combat awkward, some of the puzzles too simple. But beneath all of this, the game is full of lore that is waiting to be explored if you take the time to go off the beaten path in areas not intended to be travelled by those whose intent it is to beeline to the end. The game may not reach the same highs as The Longest Journey, but it's still a worthwhile journey in its own right. And maybe, just maybe, Zoe's adventure will resonate with you enough to pull you out of your own slump and give you enough motivation to save April Ryan. By the way, are there any games that you have played that radically changed their gameplay between one title and the next, and what did you think of them? Let me know in the comments. This has been Venoix with the review of Dreamfall: The Longest Journey, played on the Xbox 360. If you enjoyed this review, please like and subscribe for more great narrative adventure content. Thanks for taking the time to watch my videos, I appreciate you, take care of yourselves, and bye bye for now.